Most people believe narcissists move on easily, that they replace, discard, forget, and never look back. And most of the time, that's true. But there's a detail that rarely gets discussed, a quiet exception to the rule. Because while narcissists lose interest in many people, they don't lose interest in all of them. Carl Jung once observed, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For a narcissist, that acceptance never happens. Instead, anything unresolved gets pushed outward, onto other people. And when someone refuses to carry that weight, refuses to react, refuses to engage in the familiar emotional exchange, the mind doesn't settle. It circles. This isn't obsession in the way people usually imagine it. It isn't longing. It isn't admiration. And it certainly isn't affection. It's unfinished business. The narcissist becomes preoccupied, not with who you are, but with what you represent. A break in the pattern, a loss of control, a moment where their usual methods failed to produce the expected result. Jung warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Remove the language. Strip it down to psychology. What remains is this. When a person refuses to participate in emotional games, the narcissist is left alone with unanswered questions, and they are not equipped to sit with those questions for long. That is where obsession begins, not with attachment, but with discomfort. And the people who trigger that discomfort are the only ones narcissists never truly forget. What unsettles narcissists isn't loss. They lose people constantly. What unsettles them is disruption. Once you understand that difference, the confusion clears. Because attention and obsession are not the same experience, and narcissists know exactly how to chase one while being deeply disturbed by the other. Attention is easy for narcissists. It's familiar territory. They provoke it, manufacture it, harvest it. Approval, anger, admiration, even disappointment. Any reaction will do. Attention reassures them that they still occupy space in someone else's emotional world. Obsession is something else entirely. Obsession begins where attention fails, when someone reacts predictably, argues, explains, seeks reassurance, or tries to be understood. The interaction ends cleanly. The narcissist gets confirmation. Control is restored. The moment passes. But when there is no reaction, no emotional chase, no visible wound, no attempt to clarify, something breaks in the internal process. The mind doesn't register completion. The interaction stays open, unresolved. Carl Jung wrote, "What you resist persists." In psychological terms, what cannot be emotionally processed gets replayed. This is why narcissists don't obsess over the people who loved them the most. They obsess over the people who remained opaque. The ones who didn't beg, didn't retaliate, didn't collapse or perform. The ones who left quietly, without explaining themselves into exhaustion. Attention feeds certainty. Obsession feeds uncertainty. And uncertainty is unbearable to a personality built on control. Instead of moving on, the narcissist replays conversations, revisits moments, reconstructs imagined outcomes, trying to extract a reaction that never came. Not because they miss the person, but because the lack of response disrupted the story they tell themselves. Jung observed, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents." Stripped of metaphor, this points to a pattern. Unresolved internal conflicts get displaced onto others. And when someone refuses to carry that displacement, they become unforgettable. Obsession isn't desire. It's the mind circling what it failed to dominate. Once obsession replaces attention, the question changes. It's no longer why the narcissist fixates. It becomes who they fixate on. Because not everyone triggers this response. In fact, very few people ever do. And those who do tend to share traits that feel ordinary on the surface, but are deeply destabilizing to a narcissistic mindset. The people narcissists can't let go of aren't the most expressive, emotional, or accommodating. They're often the opposite. They are emotionally self-contained, not cold, not indifferent, just internally anchored. They don't outsource their sense of stability to the reactions of others. When conflict arises, they don't escalate to regain control, nor do they shrink to preserve harmony. They observe, they decide. And when they leave without spectacle. This restraint is profoundly unsettling. Carl Jung noted, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. For narcissists, irritation turns into fixation when they encounter someone who doesn't provide emotional feedback on demand. These individuals don't mirror intensity. They don't validate distortions, and most importantly, they don't confirm the narcissist's preferred self-image. Another defining trait is psychological depth paired with discretion. These people notice patterns quickly. They sense inconsistencies. But instead of confronting aggressively or seeking validation, they store the information and quietly adjust their behavior. The narcissist feels seen without being challenged, and that is more threatening than open conflict. There is also a refusal to explain. The person narcissists obsess over doesn't argue their own worth. They don't chase understanding. They don't attempt to correct misinterpretations. Their silence isn't passive. It's final. And that finality removes the narcissist's ability to rewrite the narrative. Jung warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing themselves. When someone exits without emotional negotiation, the narcissist is left alone with unanswered questions, no reaction to dissect, no weakness to exploit, no emotional imprint to overwrite. That absence becomes a mental echo, not because the person was perfect, but because they were unreachable. And what cannot be reached cannot be released. At this point, the pattern becomes clearer. It isn't strength that disturbs narcissists. It isn't intelligence. It isn't even independence on its own. What unsettles them most is detachment. The moment emotional access is quietly revoked without explanation or negotiation. Detachment is often misunderstood. It's mistaken for indifference, avoidance, or emotional shutdown. But for a narcissist, detachment registers as something far more dangerous: loss of psychological leverage. Narcissists organize their sense of stability around emotional feedback. Reactions, positive or negative, confirm relevance. They signal influence. As long as someone reacts, the narcissist remains central in that person's inner world. Detachment interrupts that signal. When someone stops reacting, stops explaining, stops defending, the usual methods fail. There is no emotional data to interpret, no tension to provoke, no reassurance to extract. The connection doesn't explode, it simply goes quiet, and silence offers no control. Carl Jung wrote, "The less that is conscious of itself, the more it assumes the character of fate." Applied psychologically, this means that when self-awareness is absent, uncertainty feels external and threatening. Detachment forces the narcissist into that uncertainty. They can't locate the cause of the rupture, so they fixate on the person who created it. Consider the moment after conflict, when no follow-up comes, no message, no attempt to clarify, no visible emotional residue. That absence becomes louder than any argument. The narcissist revisits the interaction, searching for signs they might have missed, trying to re-establish a sense of dominance after the fact. Detachment also removes the opportunity for narrative control. Without engagement, the narcissist cannot rewrite events in real time. They are left to imagine outcomes instead of shaping them. And imagination, without confirmation, becomes obsessive. Jung observed, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling." Stripped of abstraction, this points to imbalance. Detachment exposes it. The narcissist experiences the separation not as mutual distance, but as rejection of their influence. And influence for them is identity. This is why detachment doesn't end fixation. It ignites it. Not because the bond was strong, but because the control was broken. When detachment removes access, the mind looks for substitutes. If control can't be restored externally, it turns inward, then outward again. And this is where obsession takes on a more distorted shape, driven not by what was said or done, but by what was displaced. Projection is not a conscious strategy. It's a psychological shortcut, one that allows uncomfortable traits, impulses, or doubts to be relocated onto someone else. For narcissists, this mechanism is essential. It preserves a stable self-image by exporting anything that threatens it. Carl Jung wrote, "Everything that is unconscious in ourselves, we discover in our neighbor." When a narcissist encounters someone who does not react, explain, or absorb blame, projection intensifies. The person becomes a screen. Intentions are assigned. Motives are invented. Silence is interpreted as arrogance. Boundaries are recast as hostility. The fixation deepens because projection requires proximity, mental if not physical. The narcissist revisits the person repeatedly, not to understand them, but to offload unresolved tension. Each imagined interpretation serves the same function: protecting the self from scrutiny. What makes certain individuals unforgettable is their refusal to accept these projections. They don't argue against false assumptions. They don't correct distortions. They simply disengage. And without resistance, the projections have nowhere to land. This creates a feedback loop. The narcissist assigns meaning, receives no confirmation, assigns more meaning. Over time, the imagined version of the person becomes more vivid than the real one ever was. The obsession grows not because of connection, but because of misattribution, layered upon misattribution. Jung warned, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Removed from metaphor, the point is simple. What is not acknowledged internally is experienced externally as a threat. The detached individual becomes the symbolic container for everything the narcissist cannot face. That is why obsession persists long after contact ends, not because the person holds power, but because the narcissist placed their unresolved conflict there and never retrieved it. At this stage, it might seem like resolution would end the fixation. A conversation, an explanation, a final exchange, something that closes the loop. But closure assumes a willingness to reflect, and that is precisely what makes it unreachable. Closure requires responsibility. It requires the ability to examine one's role in an outcome without immediately rewriting the story. For narcissists, this is not uncomfortable. It is destabilizing. Their sense of coherence depends on preserving a specific self-image, and closure threatens to fracture it. Carl Jung observed, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." Stripped of imagery, the meaning is direct. What is avoided internally remains active. Instead of being processed, unresolved tension is kept alive through repetition. This is why narcissists don't seek closure. They simulate it. They replay conversations internally, imagining responses that were never given. They construct alternate endings where control is restored, where detachment is explained away, where the other person is reduced to a manageable narrative. But imagined resolution never settles the mind. It only sharpens fixation. The individuals narcissists obsess over make closure impossible by doing something deceptively simple. They stop participating. They don't return for final discussions. They don't clarify misunderstandings. They don't attempt to be remembered correctly. Without engagement, there is no emotional punctuation mark. The story ends mid-sentence. Jung wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble." Applied psychologically, this means some tensions cannot be resolved through control, only through acceptance. Narcissists cannot accept what they cannot dominate, so the tension remains active. Closure also threatens the narcissist's ability to assign blame. If no explanation is given, responsibility cannot be neatly relocated. The ambiguity lingers, and ambiguity and rumination. This is why obsession outlives contact. Not because the bond was deep, but because the ending never belonged to them. The mind continues searching for an answer that can't be supplied externally, because the question itself is internal. At this point, it's tempting to assume that obsession might eventually force insight, that repeated mental contact would create awareness, that fixation would lead to understanding. But with narcissism, the opposite happens. The obsession deepens, while change remains out of reach. Obsession gives the illusion of self-examination, but it isn't the same thing. It's motion without direction. The narcissist revisits the same moments, the same interpretations, the same imagined outcomes, never to learn, only to stabilize a threatened identity. Carl Jung wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." In grounded psychological terms, this means discomfort is rerouted instead of endured. Real change requires tolerating internal tension without immediately displacing it. Obsession does the opposite. It keeps attention external, fixed on another person, where blame and meaning can be endlessly rearranged. The narcissist may think about the person constantly, but the focus is never inward. Each mental replay is structured to protect the self-image. I was misunderstood. They were cold. They overreacted. These narratives don't evolve. They repeat. The people they obsess over are often mistaken for catalysts, as if their absence might inspire growth. But absence only removes resistance. It doesn't create reflection. Without accountability, the internal structure stays intact. Jung observed, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." Applied here, this reveals why obsession produces extremes but no resolution. The narcissist swings between idealizing and dismissing the person, clarity and distortion, never arriving at responsibility. Change would require acknowledging limitation, accepting uncertainty, recognizing dependence on external reactions. Each of these threatens the foundation of the narcissistic framework, so the mind chooses repetition instead. This is the paradox. The obsession feels intense. It feels consuming. It feels meaningful. But it is static. It doesn't transform behavior. It doesn't deepen awareness. It doesn't soften defenses. It only keeps the same pattern alive, long after the other person has moved on. When someone realizes they're being fixated on, a quiet assumption often follows, that the attention means something rare, that the obsession points to a deeper connection, that being remembered is the same as being valued. This is where misunderstanding takes root. Being obsessed over by a narcissist can feel disorienting. Long after the interaction ends, you may sense their presence, through indirect contact, lingering narratives, or the knowledge that you remain a point of fixation. It's easy to interpret this as significance, but obsession is not a measure of worth. Carl Jung warned, "The ego is always at the mercy of unconscious forces." In practical terms, this means fixation often has less to do with the person being fixated on, and more to do with what they represent. People assume they were special because they were irreplaceable. In reality, they were unresolved. The narcissist didn't attach to who you were, but to what they couldn't finish: control, validation, or narrative dominance. This distinction matters. If you believe you are uniquely meaningful, you may feel tempted to re-engage, to clarify, to correct the story, to finally be understood. But re-entry doesn't bring resolution. It restores the very dynamic that created the obsession in the first place. Jung observed, "Where love rules, there is no will to power." Remove the abstraction and the point sharpens. Obsession thrives where power remains contested. The moment you step back in, the fixation dissolves, not because insight occurred, but because control was regained. Being special in this context means being useful to an unresolved psychological process. That usefulness ends the moment emotional access is restored or narrative control is reclaimed. This is why narcissists often forget people they reunite with. Once the uncertainty disappears, so does the fixation. The truth is quieter and less flattering, but far more freeing. You weren't unforgettable because you were extraordinary. You were unforgettable because you didn't participate. And that is not an invitation to return. It's confirmation that leaving worked. Leaving a narcissist, even quietly, without drama, doesn't end the story. The obsession may fade on their end, but for the one who walks away, echoes linger. The aftermath is subtle, internal, and often misunderstood. It's not chaos. It's quiet, persistent, and disorienting. When you disengage from someone who cannot process detachment, the relief can be immediate. You feel free, untethered, as if a weight has been lifted. And yet, in the days and weeks afterward, subtle currents begin to ripple through your mind. Questions arise. Did I overreact? Could I have handled this differently? Was I really at fault? Even though the decision was rational and necessary, the lingering obsession creates a strange form of shadow. Proof that you mattered, in a sense, but not in the way you expected. Carl Jung noted, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is simple: unresolved emotional patterns. When a narcissist can't close the loop, the memory of their fixation often leaves the person who departed replaying interactions, examining tone, reconsidering choices. It can feel like a second ghost, quieter but heavier than the one left behind in the narcissist's mind. This aftermath isn't regret, it's reflection. The mind naturally seeks coherence. You try to understand the disruption you caused, even though it wasn't yours to fix. Silence, withdrawal, and emotional independence that once seemed effortless now carry weight because their impact was so profound on someone else, even if that someone else is incapable of true reflection. There is also a strange sense of residual responsibility. You may find yourself second-guessing whether detachment was too harsh or wondering if engagement would have calmed the obsession. But this is precisely what the narcissist counted on: the pull of doubt, the echo of unfinished interaction. The paradox is that the person who leaves quietly gains control in reality. Yet, emotionally, the process is never fully neat. You are left navigating not the narcissist's obsession itself, but the imprint of that obsession. Its questions, its imagined outcomes, and the persistent awareness that someone could not release you, even when the connection had ended. The key truth, often overlooked, is this: discomfort after leaving is natural, but it is not a sign of error. It is evidence of impact without participation, proof that independence, silence, and boundary can unsettle even the most self-absorbed minds,